On Halloween night of 2002, 21-year-old Chris Jenkins went to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota, after he had left a college keg party with some of his friends. He intended to celebrate and have some fun since he was about to graduate from the University of Minnesota and obtain his business degree, along with several potential job interviews that he had lined up. Unfortunately, Chris got separated from his friends and spilled his beer at some point, and an off-duty police officer who was working as bar security, thinking that Chris had urinated on the floor, grabbed him, threw him out of the bar, and told the bouncer to not let Chris back in. Chris, who was drunk, stuck in the cold without his keys, cell phone, identification card, wallet, and coat, was last seen walking towards the direction of his home, as some people have theorized. However, Chris never returned to his home, and after a prolonged, intensive search that initially turned up nothing, since the police had lost several key pieces of evidence that were found at the time of the search, his lifeless, still costumed body was eventually found on February 27, 2003, underneath the 3rd Avenue Bridge that spans the Mississippi River. The Minneapolis police immediately ruled Chris's death as a suicide and closed the case after that, much to the outrage of Chris's family, friends, and acquaintances. However, several discrepancies and other glaring pieces of evidence that was found through independent autopsies would soon reveal that Chris did not commit suicide, but rather was a victim of foul play, especially given the bodily evidence that showed several different wounds and bruises that were not on par with the type of injuries that someone would normally receive after jumping off the 3rd Avenue Bridge. And after the election of a new police chief, the case of Chris Jenkins was reopened, but would later grow cold as of 2006. Some people, including 2 now retired New York City Police Department officers, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, believe that Chris Jenkins was yet another victim of the Smiley Face Killers, a group that allegedly became active in the late 1990s, whose motif was targeting young, college-age men and murdering them when they were at their most vulnerable, mostly when they were drunk and leaving a bar or a college party. But in April of 2008, the FBI made a statement about the so-called Smiley Face Killers, saying that there wasn't enough evidence to support the theory that such a murderous group exists, and that Chris Jenkins' death, along with the other suspiciously similar deaths that befell 44 other college-age men like him, were the result of alcohol-related drownings. However, Chris's family, his friends, acquaintances, and even his college still keeps the memories and his case alive as much as they can in the nearly 16 years that have passed since his mysterious death, at the time of this video posting. But until new, compelling evidence is brought forward to shed some light on this event, the death of Chris Jenkins still remains a mystery. On Halloween night of 1974, Ronald Clark O'Brien gave his children poison candy in the form of pixie sticks, which ended up killing his 8-year-old son, Timothy O'Brien, and leaving his 5 other children unscathed from the murder attempt since they didn't consume the poison candy. While, unbeknownst to his neighbors and the community, he gave out the rest of the candy he had poisoned his son with to the various trick-or-treaters that he and his family had encountered during their walk around the neighborhood of Pasadena, Texas, which was in all likelihood a poor attempt at covering up his crime. Initially, when Ronald took his son to the emergency room as the boy began to succumb to the effects of the potassium cyanide, the doctors and police didn't suspect Ronald O'Brien of any wrongdoing or suspicion since Ronald made several claims about his son receiving the poisoned candy from a random house they went to when trick-or-treating. While the community that his family lived in gave into the panic and mass hysteria of their children possibly dying from poisoned candy and the long-standing myth of a mysterious person or group of people giving out poisoned candy on Halloween for their own sick kicks. Thankfully, though, no one else got sick or succumbed to death that night from the poisoned pixie sticks that Ronald handed out earlier. But after the death of Timothy, and with Ronald giving different stories and excuses when the authorities were interviewing him about the circumstances of his son's death, the investigators eventually discovered that Ronald O'Brien was over $100,000 in debt, had his car repossessed, defaulted on the mortgage to his house, and had been fired, dismissed, or laid off from 21 different jobs throughout his lifetime, with the threat of firing becoming a reality at his latest job. It was also discovered that Ronald had taken out several life insurance policies on his children, which totaled approximately $60,000, and in the morning after Timothy's death, he had made several calls to the agencies about the policy payouts. In the end, Ronald O'Brien was arrested for the murder of his son, and despite his constant objections and claims of innocence, the courts found him guilty and sentenced him to death. His wife would divorce him shortly after his conviction, and according to a former prison chaplain, Ronald would spend the next 9 years of his life isolated and alone in the prison complex, since none of the other inmates wanted to befriend or associate with a child murderer. In 1984, almost 10 years after his conviction, Ronald O'Brien was executed by lethal injection. Reportedly, over 300 demonstrators came to the prison he was executed at to cheer for his death, with some of them yelling out, "Trick or treat," as he died. Halloween is usually the time when people break out the decorations that are appropriate for the holiday. But what happens when a decoration seems more out of place among all the others? Well, one night in October of 2005 in Frederica, Delaware, a 42-year-old woman committed suicide by hanging herself from a tree that was directly across the way from several houses that were located on a moderately busy road. Her lifeless body hung nearly 15 feet from the ground, and as the neighbors went about their daily routines in the morning after her successful suicide attempt, they took notice of the hanging body as they all indulged in breakfast, and initially thought nothing of it, passing it off as yet another Halloween decoration or a prank. However, the discovery that it was a real body and not a decoration or a prank would not happen for another 3 hours. And by the time the authorities were called to the scene, the woman had long been dead. To this day, the 42-year-old woman's identity has never been revealed to the public, as far as I've been able to research. And since this event, many people who decorate their houses for Halloween tend to be a bit more wary and cautious about unknown decorations showing up on their properties that they didn't put there themselves. Because for all they know, one of those decorations might very well end up being a dead body. On Halloween night of 2008, a convicted drug dealer named Quentin Patrick was holed up in his home in Sumter, South Carolina, feeling paranoid at the sounds he heard, while handling an illegally acquired AK-47 that he kept at the ready to defend himself with. Quentin Patrick was known to be a real troublemaker and a person who had been on the wrong side of the law and the criminal underworld too many times due to his status as a drug dealer. However, his latest brush that he had encountered, which caused him to become paranoid, was a drug deal that went bad, causing a rival drug dealer to confront and shoot him at least once, without injuries. Fearing that the same rival drug dealer would be back to finish the job, Quentin Patrick acquired an AK-47 that had been illegally modified to fire in full auto and holed himself up in his house, waiting for the rival to come get him. When he heard a knock on his door that Halloween night, Quentin Patrick opened fire with his illegal firearm, nearly emptying the gun's magazine with 29 shots. However, when he opened the door, he saw that the target was not the rival drug dealer, but a family who had been out trick-or-treating and decided to knock on the door of his house next. 11 of Patrick's bullets struck 12-year-old TJ Darasaw, killing him instantly, while his father and younger brother were also hit, but survived. Quentin Patrick was arrested and taken to court, where after 5 years, he was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of TJ Darasaw, plus an additional 16 years for the illegal possession of the AK-47 that he used to murder the young boy. On Halloween night of 2013, 19-year-old Anthony Seabury was out trick-or-treating in the neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York City, New York, when an unidentified man dressed in black and wearing the popular mask from the 1996 horror film Scream burst out of the darkness and shot at him several times with a handgun, with one of the bullets striking him fatally in the head. Anthony Seabury was rushed to the Kings County Hospital, but the doctors were unable to save him from the fatal gunshot wound. 5 years later, at the time of this video's posting, Anthony's killer has never been caught. However, some web sleuthers and several officers of the New York City Police Department believe that Anthony's death was part of a series of shootings that took place that night in New York. For at 7 p.m. that night, a gunman had shot and killed 46-year-old Sean Rhodes as he sat in his Chrysler Voyager on the east side of New York. Furthermore, a 9mm handgun was found on Rhodes's lap, which police have theorized as belonging to his murderer. During the same time period, another man was shot in the torso in Jamaica, New York, while at 8:12 p.m., another man was shot in Rockaway Beach, New York. However, both men escaped serious injuries but could not identify their attackers. Later on, at 11:30 p.m., a 37-year-old man named Kevin Thompson was shot while he was in Brownsville, New York. He, too, would later die at Brookdale University Hospital, where Sean Rhodes had previously died. To this day, at the time of this video's posting, there have been no concrete leads, evidence, suspects, or arrests in connection with these shootings that took place on Halloween night of 2013. On Halloween night of 1973, 9-year-old Lisa French went out to go trick-or-treating after finishing dinner with her family in Fond du Lac County, Wisconsin. She initially wanted to dress up as a butterfly, but realized that the conditions were too cold for such a flimsy costume, and instead, she chose to dress up as a hobo when she went out. However, that would be the last time her mother and her stepfather would ever see her alive. For when Lisa French arrived at the third house in her trick-or-treating activities, she was invited in by the house's owner, the then 24-year-old Gerald Miles Turner Jr., who was a known acquaintance of the French family and was well-liked in the neighborhood by everyone. But all of that would change on that night. For once Gerald invited Lisa into his house, he would sexually assault the 9-year-old, murder her, and eventually put her body into a garbage bag and dump it nearly 4 miles outside of the town they all lived in. In the following year, after his arrest, Gerald Turner Jr. would constantly deny that he had killed Lisa French, claiming that he was sick of the police constantly harassing him and that he had been coerced into signing his confession to killing Lisa. But the judges, attorneys, the jury, the public, and the French family disagreed, especially with the overwhelming evidence being presented in court, and with many of them stating that Turner was a cold-blooded killer with no remorse and an uncontrollable sexual fantasy. Gerald Miles Turner Jr. was eventually convicted for the murder of Lisa French and was sentenced to prison, where everyone, including the French family, says he deserves to rot and die in. We have all heard the stories about kids, teenagers, and young adults pulling pranks on Halloween, some of them harmless, while others end with disastrous results on either the pranksters or the victims of the prank. And sometimes those disastrous results have ended up in death. Such was the case in October of 1999 in Buena Park, California, where Pete T. Solomona confronted his 17-year-old neighbor, Brandon Ketz-Dever, as he caught the teenager trying to steal one of his Halloween decorations from his front yard. Pete Solomona initially stormed outside in anger with a gun in his hand to confront the teenager. However, what happened next has become the subject of much debate and controversy, as apparently, while Pete was confronting Brandon, the gun went off and killed the 17-year-old. While other sources say that Pete exchanged angry words with Brandon, and at one point raised the gun and shot him dead in anger. Still, other sources say that Pete simply marched up to Brandon as he was trying to get away, and shot him dead without any words being exchanged. The shooting received both state and national attention, and in the following 3 years, Pete Solomona and the family of Brandon Ketz-Dever would go through 3 different trials until finally, in May of 2002, Pete was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, with the jury adding that the gun went off by accident and that Pete made a bad judgment call in regards to the manner in which he confronted Brandon. The family of Brandon Ketz-Dever wasn't too happy with the result of the trial, but in several interviews afterwards, they admitted to the relief that the drama of the whole ordeal was finally over and that they could move on with their lives. The courts eventually sentenced Pete Solomona to 11 years in prison. And to this day, the death of Brandon Ketz-Dever has become a cautionary tale that parents use around Halloween for their kids, to let them know that while it may seem like innocent fun to steal Halloween decorations off of someone's property, it could very well end up in death. On Halloween night of 1994, the Bagley family was out for a night of fun, happiness, and trick-or-treating in North Las Vegas. However, their night of fun would turn into a night of true horror and heartbreak. According to the witnesses, a man who the family allegedly did not know jumped out of the darkness and opened fire upon the Bagley family. The oldest daughter, the wife, and the aunt were all hit by bullets, but managed to survive when they were all taken to the hospital later on. However, 7-year-old Tony Bagley was hit in the head and died instantly at the scene, while the gunman got away. When police interviewed the witnesses, the only statements they would make about the mysterious gunman was that he was a black man who was around 5 feet 8 inches tall and was dressed in dark clothing that helped him blend into the darkness of the neighborhood. Strangely, Tony Bagley's father, Anthony Bagley, would not, or refused to, make any statements about who could have possibly wanted his son dead, or why anyone would target him and his family in the first place. Although some family members that were interviewed made several claims that the mysterious gunman was from a gang or organized crime group that was sent to enact a revenge killing on Anthony Bagley in retaliation to a drug deal that had gone bad involving him. However, the police couldn't make any solid links between the shooting and those claims. For the last 24 years, at the posting of this video, the murder of Tony Bagley has gone unsolved. And despite receiving national attention on America's Most Wanted 2 years after the event, there is still no concrete leads, evidence, or suspects in relation to the 7-year-old's death, and no new witnesses have come forward to confirm or to deny any of the endless rumors that have arisen from this mysterious case. Even Tony's father, Anthony Bagley, still refuses to make any statements or claims about who or why his son was murdered and his family was targeted. Even as he was arrested several years later, convicted in court for murder in an unrelated case, and sent to prison where he still remains, as of 2015, he still hasn't made any claims or statements about his son and the circumstances of that Halloween night in 1994. The following true story was previously covered in an earlier video I made some time ago, but now here is some additional information that I didn't cover beforehand. On October 31st, 1969, 19-year-old Reet Sylvia Jurvetson, a citizen who was native to Montreal, Quebec, Canada, contacted her family by post for the last time to ease their worries they had about her sudden move to Los Angeles, California, United States of America, with a man she had become infatuated with, who went by the alias of John or Jean. And, according to some reports, was a man who apparently maintained his looks to resemble that of the lead singer of The Doors, Jim Morrison. However, when there was no further contact from Reet Jurvetson after the established date, her family initially sent a private investigator to try and locate her whereabouts and to see if she was okay. But in the end, his investigation turned up nothing. For the next 46 years, Reet Jurvetson's whereabouts remained unknown to her family until, in 2015, after seeing a composite drawing of an unidentified woman on a missing and unidentified persons website, Anne Jurvetson, who was the victim's sister, submitted a DNA sample to the Los Angeles Police Department's Cold Case Squad. When her sample and a sample from the victim's blood-stained bra was compared, they were a match. After nearly 50 years, Jane Doe 59, or Sherry Doe, was finally revealed as Reet Sylvia Jurvetson. But with her identity finally revealed, one question remained: who killed her? At the time of this video posting, the Los Angeles Police Department's Cold Case Squad has 3 persons of interest who they believe have some information about Reet Jurvetson's death. The first is, obviously, the man she left Canada with to go to California in 1969, who went by the alias of John or Jean. The second is another man who was a roommate of the first man, allegedly, who apparently also went by the name of Jean, and styled his looks after one of the members of the Beatles. While the third person of interest is a neighbor who lived in the same apartment complex, who went by the name of M. Lindhorst, who police believe had close contact with Reet Jurvetson and who probably knows more about what happened than anyone else. However, web sleuthers and conspiracy theorists believe that Reet Jurvetson was yet another victim of the Manson family cult, since her body was located nearly 6 miles from the place where Charles Manson and his family cult committed the Tate LaBianca murders. However, it is unknown if the LAPD ever questioned Manson or his family cult about Reet Jurvetson. And since Charles Manson passed away in 2017, the world may never know if he or his family cult murdered Reet Jurvetson. John Douglas White was a man who, despite all the odds, and in the face of 2 cases from his past which sent him to prison both times, was known to be a true psychopath and a sadistic, cold-blooded murderer who relished in the pain and suffering he caused to his victims. His first victim was a 17-year-old girl named Teresa Etherton, who he had politely invited to his home for a visit in 1980 when he was living in Battle Creek, Michigan. However, when Teresa arrived at his house, he attempted to stab the young girl to death. Fortunately, she survived the murder attempt and stood as a key witness in White's trial after he was arrested. White was sentenced to prison for 5 to 10 years. However, he only served 2 years due to a successful appeal and mistakes that were made on the court system's side of things. After being let out, White was given 2 years probation and mandatory mental health counseling courses, with the promise that he wouldn't face any more jail time as long as he kept true to the sanctions of his probation and his visits to mental health counseling courses. However, in 1994, John White would attempt another murder attempt, and he would be successful at committing it. A 26-year-old woman named Vicky Sue Wall would disappear from her last known location, which was Comstock Township, Michigan. And when police discovered that the last person who saw her alive was John White, suspicion of murder was quickly assessed, given White's past murder attempt of Teresa Etherton. White attempted to commit suicide before the police could close in on him, but failed to die, and was eventually arrested and brought to court once again after the police had discovered the decayed body of Vicky Sue Wall in Kalamazoo County, Michigan. After a short trial period, John White was sentenced to an 8 to 15-year prison sentence. But once again, utilizing a successful appeal and the loopholes in the justice system, John Douglas White became a free man in 2007. For the next 5 years, John Douglas White would live in a trailer park in Isabella County, Michigan, where he would eventually become a pastor at a local church and befriend a 24-year-old woman named Rebecca Gay, who was the daughter of his current fiancée that he was planning to marry, and who also had a 3-year-old son. Once again, White's murderous fantasies would boil to the surface, as on Halloween night of 2012, he strangled and murdered Rebecca Gay, took her lifeless body into the nearby woods, had sex with it, allegedly, and buried it. Once he got home, he then dressed her son up in his Halloween costume and then handed the boy off to his father once he arrived to pick him and his wife up. However, when he discovered that his wife was not at the scene, he panicked and made a call to the authorities. Immediately, the search began for the missing Rebecca Gay, whose body was later found in the woods. Once again, John White was arrested and sent to trial for the murder and sexual violation of Rebecca Gay, especially after he confessed to killing her. In spite of all this, John White claimed that he couldn't remember anything and that he did not have any sexual relations with Rebecca's corpse after he had killed her. The judge, the district attorney, and the lead investigators, along with the jury, didn't believe any of his alibis, and once again, another murder trial was set for John White. In April of 2013, White was sentenced to a 56-year prison term for the murder of Rebecca Gay. Later, in August of 2013, John Douglas White committed suicide in his prison cell.